Hello everybody and welcome to week 4. This video is going to go backwards and look a little bit at week 3. The thing I really want to drive home in this video is that the job and the skill set of the best practices, volunteer engagement strategies, chief volunteer engagement officer are very different, or need to be very different than what we might once have thought we needed for the traditional volunteer manager role. So let me just go over why that's important. First, it's important in case you decide you want to get out of school and be a volunteer manager. It's really important for you to understand the scope of skills and duties that you would be looking forward to. The second reason it's important is because the newfangled Chief Volunteer Engagement Officer, the CVEO for short, is going to have a completely different kind of job in several very important ways. And that's what I want to talk to you about. In the old world, the Director of Volunteer Services or the volunteer manager or coordinator, whatever title that traditional person went by, is very likely to be often in office more or less by themselves doing the things that volunteer managers do. The interface with the rest of the staff probably happens in one of two ways. Either at regularly scheduled staff meetings, the volunteer services director will remind people that if they know that they need a volunteer, that they should email the volunteer manager or come down the hall to talk to the volunteer manager about the kinds of people they think they need so that the volunteer manager can add those persons to their recruitment project, right? Or maybe the volunteer manager is more assertive than that and sets an appointment quarterly with each of the project managers and goes from person to person quarterly to see whether or not everything's working out for them and whether there are any other volunteer positions that they would like to see. And they kind of collect, titles that the volunteer manager, that the volunteers need to be, and they take them back. And then they do what they do. They frame a recruiting message. They think about where best to go recruit those people, which we'll talk about later in the semester. And then when people show up in response, they interview and screen them. And if it works out, then they orient and train them for their jobs as volunteers. And often they're the direct supervisor. And they also, if they're not the direct supervisor, they also serve as the go-to person when somebody has a problem. Either a volunteer has a question that they need answered, or either the staff or the volunteer where the person is engaged needs to know something about the policies about how volunteers are handled. They're the expert and they get called in. Later, of course, the volunteer manager's job also is to appreciate and show gratitude and also to assess the volunteers' services and the whole volunteer program. That's very traditional. And that's it. It's kind of a line item thing that they're down there doing that down the hall, and they do have some interface, but it's kind of limited. They don't have people really telling them what to do or how to do it. In the newfangled best practices volunteer engagement strategy, the new Chief Volunteer Engagement Officer has a completely different role. Instead of figuring out, instead of going down the hall and asking once a quarter or reminding people in a staff meeting, the volunteer engagement officer is going to have a critical role actually at the table when each of the program managers is strategizing their own programs. Every time there's a program meeting, when the program people are talking about, okay, this is a program we're considering adding, or they're thinking about evaluating the programs that they already have going and how well are they achieving the mission. Anytime there is a conversation at all about adjusting, adapting, adding, or deleting a conversation, a volunteer engagement officer needs to be at the table. And the reason for that is that the strategic engagement of volunteers in this best practices model is just one tool or one resource that an organization has to meet its mission. So when the program people are talking about how to achieve the program goals, whatever those are, they are thinking about all the tools they can bring to the table. They are thinking about money. They are thinking about staff availability or staff that will be needed. They are thinking about what collaborative partners in the community might they need, and every other kind of resource to actually achieve their achieve their mission. So let's just come up with let me just use an example. Let's say we have a domestic violence organization, and they have a program, and the program has to do with going out to meet with women victims, and helping them get educated about the services and resources and so forth. So we're talking about victim advocates, right? And in the scope of the conversation of victim advocates, there's going to be a lot of things that a program manager is going to talk about. One is, what is the population out there that we'd like to serve? So how many victim advocates do we need? Two is, what kind of skills do we need to hire in these victim advocates? What do they need to come with? And what are we willing to train them? So maybe it's important that they have, a lot of empathy and good people skills, but they could be trained in the specifics of working with victims, which are a very unique population, and there are specifics. Maybe they need transportation, et cetera, and so forth. So when they are talking about all of this, one of the questions becomes, how can volunteers help us really bulk up our victim advocate program? And I don't know what the ideas might be around the table, but I could think of all kinds of ways. A volunteer might actually be paired with a victim advocate, and the victim advocate could be training the volunteer, and they could work together. For example, I'm sure that victim advocates have a lot of work that they do, not just meeting with the victims, but also calling resources on behalf of the victim, or searching for resources that are specific to the victim's needs. Perhaps the victim is ready to get out of the house, but wants to take her teenage children and her dogs with her because she doesn't want to leave them to become the new target for the abuser. So maybe that involves some research around what kind of transitional housing or what kind of shelters might take a whole family and pets. Well, the victim advocate might not need to do all of that themselves. If the victim advocate is working as a team with a volunteer, the victim advocate's going to have a lot more time, right? So maybe the victim advocate and the volunteer meet, and they talk about the particular clients of the victim advocate and what kind of support they're going to need and what kind of research they're going to be doing, and they divide that up among themselves. This actually could be a really great role for a volunteer, particularly because you could have several volunteers, and a victim advocate could maybe have a volunteer that works with him or her on 2 families, and a different volunteer that has the time to work maybe on 3 or 4 families, in terms of that kind of work. And anyway, the point is, discrete tasks that are appropriate for volunteers might indicate that would be a great place to use volunteers. So given that they are talking about the whole strategy of building their victim advocate program, the question becomes, for the chief volunteer engagement officer, how can I coach and help the program manager understand the variety of things that a volunteer could do? Maybe the program manager has never ever thought about incorporating a volunteer in such a substantive way into a program. Maybe that program manager has only seen volunteers who work around the office 4 or 5 hours a week, or who show up at events, fundraising events, to staff them and so forth. A good Chief Volunteer Engagement Officer can help educate the program manager and talk them through how volunteers might be engaged in a strategic way to help improve the organization's ability to meet the mission, and also how how they would be trained and all that other kind of stuff. So you can see that the chief volunteer engagement officer, volunteer manager, whatever they are called, would have a much bigger job than in the traditional model. They basically are there to coach all of the different program people and other people that work in the organization about all the possible ways that volunteers can be used, and basically ask them the question, if you had more help, where would you put it to use? And then talk them through whether or not there is a possible way to use a volunteer to help get those capacities built. All right, so what about training and orientation and support and management? How would the new fangled Chief Volunteer Engagement Officer's role look different? Well, for the most part, in the old role, those were tasks that were handled by the volunteers. The question arises for some of you about whether or not a volunteer manager needs to actually have substantive topic knowledge in the area of the mission of the organization. So in my case, does someone who comes in as a volunteer management expert also need to have had in the past domestic violence experience, not as a victim, but working in a domestic violence environment? Or is it okay for them to just come in with knowledge, really solid knowledge of how to manage and expertly help volunteers make the organization even more successful? I would maintain that while it might be nice for a newfangled volunteer engagement officer to have topical background, if they don't, that's okay. And to switch gears a little bit, I was a lawyer for a long time before I got my PhD and began teaching. I was an expert in certain kind of law. I was an administrative and regulatory lawyer and a legislative attorney, which all those things go together. They're all lawmaking, rulemaking, just in different places. Legislative is obviously lobbying at some level and also drafting potential laws and that sort of thing. Regulatory lawyers are those who deal with regulations that have already been put in place, or they help do the rulemakings. And I knew everything about the bureaucratic system and the legislative system. But what I didn't always know was everything about my client's topic. It was their job to deeply educate me so that I could do the best job in the system. But I came with the system tools and they gave me the content information. And then I was able to go down and work in those government environments. It's not that I was working alone. If we worked something out in a government environment, I brought it back to my clients. And if there was something that they had not educated me well enough that I had understood, they could basically explain to me ramifications of something that I had worked out down there. And I would toddle on back and say, I talked to my client and they need this adjusted because. That is exactly the same kind of relationship that somebody who is an expert in managing and engaging volunteers brings to the table. And the people who run the programs can actually bring the content knowledge to the volunteer management person. But what that may mean is that when it comes down to who does the orientation and training, it's not the volunteer engagement officer. It may be that if you're bringing somebody in to work in a program in a substantively meaningful way, that they get oriented and trained by the people who are the managers of the program, just like a new staff person would. In other words, they get much more engaged and integrated into those programs, and they're not kept separate by the volunteer person being their main or only contact. So again, that is very different. Whereas A traditional volunteer manager may have all the orientation and training responsibility. That may shift to the program people, especially if the jobs that they cook up to help them get, uh, you know, to achieve more to mission accomplishment involves putting them in much more substantive and strategic positions. Now, that doesn't mean that the rest of the skills are that different. A volunteer engagement officer would probably talk to the program person about how they appreciate, assess, and reward and uh, be grateful to employees, and they might try to do some of the same things for the volunteers. But they also have to recognize that volunteers are, in fact, volunteers. They don't get paid, and they do need a different kind of gratitude. And the volunteer engagement officer in both the traditional and the new practices would probably be going about the business of figuring out the best ways to assess and to reward and appreciate those volunteers. But they would probably bring the best practices way would probably do a much better job of integrating the staff, the program staff, into those efforts. As you can see, if you look at the chart that I've got out here, the very last thing is where and how do the volunteers serve? Primarily in the old model, they have direct service roles. So they get brought in to work with the clients in one way or the other, or maybe they are working in the office doing the kind of tasks that pile up and are not triaged by the staff. But as we can see in the new model, because we have somebody who is highly skilled in volunteer engagement and retention and management, it and strategy, it is possible to completely enhance and build extra capacity into the organization in every possible program and department through the organization. And so it enlarges the number of ways that we can engage volunteers, and volunteers can be beneficial. And so you see that in this new strategy, we have a much more efficient and effective and expanded way to use volunteers. But you also see that it is a completely different job for the volunteer manager, who used to be off kind of doing their own thing and probably only answered to the executive director. Now, however many programs you have, you're going to have that many. They may not be your bosses, but you're going to have to please, satisfy, work with them, understand everything they do and what they need and why. It's a much more skill intensive job, and it's a much more interactive role with the staff as opposed to just the volunteers. And I hope you can see that it's also a much more valuable role for the organization overall. Okay, I've taken up 18 minutes of your time. I think that's enough. And before I go, I will just say don't forget to look at the week 4 Hot 5 Things to Know on the Blackboard link menu, and I will see you on the boards.